Welcome to the meeting of the Culture, Media and Sport Select Committee. We're joined by Nandy, the Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport, and by Susannah Storey, the Department's Permanent Secretary. You're both very welcome today. This is the first of our regular sessions in this Parliament that will be looking at the work of the Department for Culture, Media and Sport. So we're going to be asking you questions from right across your department's portfolio, including some of the announcements that you've made, areas that the committee are working on at the moment, so we'd really be keen to hear your thoughts on. And then, of course, there are some issues that people across the CMS sectors have contacted us about, and we've got a lot to get through. So we're going to try and keep our questions short, and we'd be really grateful if you can be quite direct in answering our questions, because we want you to be able to escape in a reasonable time. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to kick off the questions. So the Culture, Media and Sport Department represents sectors which, when added together, are worth so much more to the UK economy than so many other government departments. And certainly, as far as soft power goes, very few government departments have got so much global reach. You're also responsible for 42 agencies and public bodies. That's more than any other government department. And yet you've only got one full-time and two part-time ministers beside yourself. And the autumn budget confirmed a real-time decline of 2.5% in your resource budgets. Is this a government that takes culture, media and sport sectors seriously?
Yes, I think we are, and thank you for your question, and thank you for the opportunity to talk with you more about this important area. We have a very strong ministerial team. We have Chris Bryant and Stephanie Peacock, both of whom held those positions in shadow form in the last Parliament, so have a lot of experience. Chris Bryant is shared, as you rightly pointed out, Chair, with DSIT. We think that is a strength because, particularly around the creative industries, there is a lot of overlap with the work that DSIT is doing, and we need to make sure that that conversation is seamless. And then we obviously have Baroness Twycross in the House of Lords, who brings with her a considerable amount of experience as well. So we are very confident in the team. And on the issues that you just discussed, I mean, of course, finances are tight, but we've just been through the spending review process, and we came out of that pretty well, given the difficult economic circumstances. We're able, therefore, to commit to continuing a large number of the programmes that are already in train, and you'll have seen that we also announced an expansion of some programmes like the Creative Skills programme, which is so important to the economy. The Foreign Secretary and I have also shortly to establish a Soft Power Council, which will be co-chaired by the two of us. So we've put creative industries at the heart of our industrial strategy. So this is a government that takes this very seriously indeed, not just because it enriches people's lives, but because it is so central to the economy and to the reach that we're able to have all over the world.
I've mentioned that you're responsible for all these agencies and public bodies and arm's length bodies. They've been subject to a number of high-profile incidents in the last few years. The BBC was embroiled in an equal pay scandal. The former curator at the British Museum stole 1,800 items, and the British Library suffered a catastrophic ransomware attack. How can you reassure us that your department is now fully across all of those challenges?
Well, I've had a full briefing on the risks that currently exist, as well as the issues that you mentioned. And I've had meetings with all of those institutions that you mentioned in order to make sure that they're really gripping this and that the department is providing what they need. But we run a risk register, so we look across all of our arm's length bodies to see what live risks exist, how prominent we think, how likely we think they are to happen, and to put in place mitigation measures. So, for example, on the example of the British Library, we're working across government to make sure that we've got the right processes and systems in place to protect organisations from those sorts of attacks. I don't know if there's anything that you wanted to add.
Yeah, I mean, you're right, Chair, that we have got this extraordinary range of arm's length bodies, and they do such important things for the country. What we try and make sure is each of them has principal accounting officers, and then me as the principal accounting officer stay very close to those chairs. We have regular forums, as the Secretary of State says. We have an audit and risk committee that looks at the risks that they're holding. So sometimes things do happen, like the cyber attack, which is very difficult, and we work closely with them afterwards. But what we're trying to make sure is we have a shared sense of what's going on, and we can help them when these things happen. And obviously on things like cyber, when we look into the next spending review, which I think will have a sort of tech focus, we want to try and make sure we can think about ways in which we might be able to help them protect themselves.
So on your risk register, where's the next scandal coming from?
I think that would...
I think the point of the risk register is that we make sure that it doesn't, because we're ahead of these things and we can predict where problems are likely to arise and make sure that we address them early.
Did you not have a risk register before then?
No, we've always had a risk register, and it's a dynamic thing. So what it tends to do is look at some of the things that might be going on in the sector, some of which I'm sure we'll talk about today, like artificial intelligence and what does that mean for some of our institutions and sectors. But it also can look at issue-specific areas. So, for example, after the British Museum theft, they've put in place a series of actions and a lessons learned review, and then we are tracking that. So it's a mixture of sectoral things and also specific things that the institutions are experiencing.
There are too many. Are there too many arm's length bodies that the DCMS is responsible for?
Well, we certainly, one of the things that we've done as a new government is come in and have a look at the way in which we're delivering to get the right outcomes. So, for example, with the Arts Council, we shortly intend to start a review of the Arts Council. We've taken a bit of time to consider how that review should work, and particularly around the terms of reference. But one of my concerns is that as we've seen creativity downgraded in the curriculum, and as we've seen very big cuts to council budgets across the country, there are whole parts of the country that have become cultural deserts, where young people in particular don't have access to arts and culture at all. And that's one of the things that we want to address through the Arts Council review. It will look at whether delivering through the Arts Council is actually working, whether it needs to change its way of operation, and whether we need to tighten its remit. So, we're looking at these things at the moment about the operation of arm's length bodies. There are none on the list that we've looked at that we think there is no purpose to this body. They're all doing, as the Permanent Secretary said, good work, but it's whether we're actually getting the right outcomes from that work, and that's what we're focusing on.
So there are reports in the paper this morning that Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, is going to be demanding 5% savings from every government department. Where are you going to start looking for those in DCMS?
Well, I haven't had a formal approach. I read the papers like everybody else and read the reports over the weekend, but we haven't started that process officially yet. We are aware, though, that money is tight, and until we can get the economy growing, we will be in a challenging set of circumstances. We're also very aware that there's a lot of fragility in our sectors, in music, in arts, in museums. We've got an ageing set of building stock that we've got to deal with, which is one of the reasons that we were pleased with the outcome of the last spending review, because we were able to get quite significant amounts of funding released for capital expenditure. But we do have to look at these things. For example, in the last spending review, I took the decision to cancel the Seaside Heritage Fund. That was something that we inherited from the last government, but it didn't have any funding attached. By definition, I believe a fund should have funding attached to it, but the funding wasn't there, so we took the difficult decision to do that. Similarly, with the National Citizen Service, as you know, we recently took a decision to wind that down. We think that the money is better spent, given the enormous challenges facing this generation of young people, on really helping them to grip those, rather than a summer camp for a few weeks every year. They need year-round support to really help with those enormous challenges. And so we're making sure that the money that we have is better spent, and that does mean taking some tough decisions, but it shouldn't mean, if we get this right, getting worse outcomes. It should mean better outcomes.
Those are quite tiny sums of money, Lisa. You've already seen real terms cut of 2.5% in the budget, and now potentially staring down the barrel of an additional 5% from your, cutting small projects is not ever going to amount to that sort of sum. Where are you thinking that this sort of money is going to come from?
Well, for example, with the youth budget, one of the things that we've done is allocate 100 million of dormant asset funding to youth, to make sure that young people aren't losing out from the tough financial circumstances that we find ourselves in. But I don't know if it'd be helpful for you to say something about the sort of business planning process.
Yeah, I was going to, if that's okay. The first thing to say, Chair, is, as you say, there was a resource cut, but on the capital side for 25-26 we actually got an increase of 16%. So it isn't only the cut side. We do expect, when the Spending Review Commission comes, just as has been trailed in the press, that we will have to look line by line through all of our areas of spend, and I think that's difficult for everybody. For us, as you rightly say, we've got 42 arm's length bodies and 75% of our money goes straight out the door to them. So what we will need to do is look across each of our areas of spend, across all of the areas of DCMS, and then work out with the Secretary of State where she wants to prioritise. At the moment, we're in the middle of business planning for the next financial year, so we haven't yet reached those decisions about exactly how we're going to allocate the money that we've been given by the Treasury, but that's what we're trying to do now, and to do it in a thoughtful way. And then, as the Secretary of State says, I think really trying to work out in our sectors, where can we galvanise private sector investment? As you know, the lottery's just had its 30th birthday, and enormous good cause funding there. So really trying to look across the whole piece at the funding for these sectors. But I do think the backdrop's going to be difficult in the next year.
One of the things we hear from the sectors that we represent on this select committee all the time is that the role of the DCMS Secretary of State has often felt like a bit of an afterthought in successive governments. But between 2010 and 2024, there were 12 different DCMS Secretaries of State. I mean, that's potentially disastrous for long-term policy making, as you know. Now, we all know that you weren't doing this job in opposition. You were, in fact, predominantly in foreign affairs and international development facing roles. So to what extent do you feel that you're suited for this role, that you want this role, and that you're a natural fit for it?
Crikey. I think the first thing I would say is that I very much share your view that longevity is a good thing. But I suppose the first thing I would say is I did a mixture of roles in opposition, including levelling up for quite some time. And because of that, and because over the last 14 years I've had the incredible privilege to represent Wigan in Parliament, a town that has been at the absolute epicentre of some of the political earthquakes that we've seen, where people feel very, very strongly that their contribution has neither been seen nor valued by successive governments for far too long. This sense that they've been written off and written out of our national story, and the things that they care about have most disappeared. Because of that, I have a very strong sense that people must be heard, so that every person can live a richer, larger life and see themselves reflected in the story we tell ourselves about ourselves as a nation. And so, particularly at this moment, with the great upheaval across the country, this real toxicity and anger in many communities, I think this department in particular plays the key role in government in helping to foster that much more cohesive country. So, for example, the work that we're taking forward from the last government to strengthen the Football Governance Bill, these institutions that stand at the centre of our towns, as James knows only too well, that are part of our civic inheritance and help to give definition and meaning to people's lives. Investing in skills in the creative industries through the expansion of the Creative Industries Skills Programme, because as we're putting rocket boosters under the creative industries in every nation and region, we have to ensure that those young people can get those jobs so that they can be part of writing the next chapter of our national story. We want people to see themselves reflected in that, and I think for that reason, that belief in people, the value and the contribution that they make to our country, and that knowledge that comes from the last 14 years of having represented my town here, as well as working very closely with the last government on the levelling up agenda, I think this is a great opportunity for me, but I also think I'm absolutely the right fit for this job at this moment.
If you were offered a different role in Cabinet, would you take it?
Well, I mean, the gaffer picks the team, as I've discovered to my cost on many occasions over the last 14 years. But I can honestly say to you, hand on heart, if I was offered the choice of any role in the Cabinet, this would absolutely be it.
Thank you very much, Lisa. How are you doing? Regarding the industrial strategy, that's obviously very important to the government. And if you look at sort of the areas that underpins the sort of industrial strategy, areas like sport, heritage are missing from that. Any reason why those areas, and even tourism as well, any reason why those areas are not necessarily referenced?
So we know that those industries play an enormously important role in the economy. There's no question about that. But what the Department for Business and Trade did when they developed the industrial strategy is worked with all government departments to look at those industries that we think have the greatest potential for growth, and particularly have the greatest potential for growth in every nation and region. Our growth mission is not just about growing the economy, it's about providing those opportunities in every part of Britain so that people can make that contribution to the national effort. And if you look at the creative industries, in areas like video games, film, you've got enormous growing sectors. You've got jobs being created, and high-end TV, you've got jobs being created in every part of the country. I'm shortly about to go up to Sunderland, for example, where the film industry is making massive investments. We've got work going on in Birmingham. We've just invested in Manchester and Liverpool. And we're really seeing not just jobs being created, but good quality jobs that pay well and stimulate the local economy. So there's no intention to write off the contribution that other DCMS sectors make. It's just a recognition that with small amounts of government support and a will to create the right conditions, these are the sectors that can make the biggest contribution to growth.
Okay. And in terms of sort of other sectors, how do you feel the department is set up to support them?
So just to take an example that you gave around tourism, for example, the Minister, Chris Bryan, is doing an enormous amount of work at the moment on tourism and working with colleagues at MHCLG around their towns strategy. There are many coastal and seaside towns in every part of Britain that have great potential for tourism. And recently I visited Blackpool, for example, where we think there's more potential for growth there through the pleasure beach and other associated industries. But what is happening at the moment is that the government is spending quite large sums of money in towns like Blackpool, but it's not coordinated, and it isn't set up to support the local growth plan. So part of our manifesto commitment was that every area must have a local growth plan, and what we're currently doing is coordinating investment and support to make sure that it supports local priorities and gets more bang for its buck. That's just one example, but we're working across the board, whether it's the music industry, advertising, all of the different industries that our department is responsible for, to make sure that we are growing those industries, we're supporting those industries, and we're extending the reach of them as well, because for sports, arts, music, these play a really important part in our cultural life, and we want to make sure that every person in Britain can access them. I don't know if you wanted to have anything.
I really agree with that. I feel like the department is organised along sectoral lines, and what we try and do is make sure we're really close to all of the sectors: tourism, sport, creative industries, civil society, culture, youth, and so on. And as the Secretary of State says, I think what's really interesting in this government is we're starting to look much more about place, and the work MHCLG is doing on devolution, and really working in partnership with them. So DCMS does have the privilege of these extraordinary sectors that bring so much hope and happiness to people's lives, but we know that our job is to work really closely with those sectors for all the reasons we've been discussing.
Okay. And so in July you came into the role. How do you feel the department was positioned to sort of take on board the direction that the new government wants from it?
I mean, it's, I think you might want to add something about this, but I think it is challenging when you get a new government, especially after 14 years. That's a long time in which civil servants have been working to one set of priorities. I think what's really helped us, though, is that we're a mission-led government, and our department in particular sits very much at the nexus of the missions. I represent us on 4 out of the 5 mission boards because of the critical role that our sectors play to delivering healthier lifestyles, opportunities for children, growth in the economy, We also the one I don't sit on is the energy, the GB Energy mission, but we do play a very key role in working closely with Ed Miliband and his team to make sure that we're, particularly because of our ageing stock, building stock, that we're doing everything that we can to make them much more energy efficient. So I think we've turned the wheels and we're really starting to make progress. Just in the first few months alone, for example, we've been able to get the Football Governance Bill into the House of Lords and it's progressing there. We've been able to announce a whole series of things, including the funding for the next Olympics programme and Paralympics programme, which is incredibly important, as you know, because you lose good talent if you don't do that early. We've announced the National Youth Strategy. We're about to launch the review of the Arts Council. I've started preliminary discussions with the BBC about the Charter Review. So we've been able to really hit the ground running, and I think that is a tribute to the work of the civil servants in the department.
And just to add, from our side, you know, we obviously want to support this government as best we can. So I'm spending a lot of time with the Secretary of State and her ministerial team to try and understand their priorities, because with my limited resource, I want to make sure it's focused on the things that you want, and that's what we're trying to make sure we're on the front foot on.
Okay, brilliant. Just moving quickly to the sort of freelancers, the creative industry. As you know, it's pretty much sort of underpinned by freelancers and creative people. What do you think, I suppose, what's the government's view with regards to how it can support that sort of, you know, that catalyst for sort of change, that catalyst for creativity, that catalyst for new dimensions within industry? What is the government doing to try and support them? Are you speaking to them? Do they have a voice very much in your sort of policy sort of formation?
Very much so. So I've met with the major unions in the field, and we also, with most of the key industry bodies as well. This is something that I'm particularly concerned about and want to get right. You'll have seen over the last few months there have been a number of things that have been very prominent in the public debate and in the media, in particular the Greg Wallace allegations that are currently been made. And one of my concerns is that these creative industries in particular have a lot of freelancers. It's very casual employment contracts. People are often employed or promoted because of who they know, whether they're liked and trusted. And you do get a lot of younger people coming in to those industries, and there is an enormous power imbalance between the people who run those industries and the people who work in them. We obviously, through the Department for Business and Trade and through the Deputy Prime Minister, we're pursuing the plan to make work pay, and they're looking very closely at things like the use of unpaid internships, which they're intending to consult on, self-employed workers, zero-hours contracts, harassment. But I am also meeting tomorrow with CISA, which you will know is the new body that is being set up to deal with this in the creative industries. It's an industry-led body, but you know, having spoken to the BBC in recent weeks about the Greg Wallace allegations, I am really clear that we're seeing too many of these cultures of silence and issues being swept under the rug, people who cannot advance through the current complaint system because it would have an impact on their career, potentially ending their career. And I am clear that people need to be heard, action has to be taken, and perpetrators have to be held to account. Now, I'm having this meeting with CISA tomorrow. They think, and I instinctively think, that it is better if the industry grips this. But if they don't, I will be prepared to take further action. And I was quite astonished, to be honest, that when I got the list of organisations that are financially supporting CISA, Banijay, the company that was employing Greg Wallace, made the production for MasterChef, is not on that list. I'll take quite a dim view of company executives who don't take this seriously. And after I've had those discussions with CISA, I will write to the chair to update the committee on the work that we're taking forward with them.
No, thank you for that. What I would also say is areas like late payments as well. Sometimes that's an area where freelancers feel they may not have a voice as such because they want the next gig. They want the next contract, and it's a very symbiotic world, certainly in certain niches. So I would definitely implore sort of the late payment aspects as well to be sort of front and centre as well.
I will absolutely take that away and feed that into the Secretary of State for Business and Trade and make sure that it's part of our Make Work Pay consultation.
Yeah. And one last thing I wanted to ask you regarding sort of grassroots sort of music. So big arenas are being asked to sort of support sort of smaller grassroots venues. Do you feel that the large arenas are taking it seriously? Do you think that they understand the position and the role they play in the food chain of music production and concert production?
Well, we're really concerned about the closure of live music venues. My town in Wigan, we produced The Verve, who started out life at a local college and then went on to play at a whole series of music venues around the town. Not one single one of those music venues now exists, and we're seeing closures at a rate that is genuinely very alarming. It's early days for the industry levy. Obviously, we very much support that. And Minister Bryant has been clear that we expect to see tangible progress on the industry levy by the first quarter of 2025. We're really encouraged that some big artists have come forward to support that, but we want to see more. And so next week, the Minister is convening an industry roundtable to make that clear. We want this to succeed. We think it's better if the industry gets its own house in order. But grassroots music and grassroots music venues are the engine of the music industry, which is, we are the third largest exporter of music in the world. And if the industry can't get its act together, then we've been absolutely clear that we will act to introduce a statutory levy if the voluntary levy doesn't succeed.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Bayo. Just quickly going back on to CISA, I'm really pleased that you're meeting with them because I think it's a very much needed intervention in the creative industries. When I met with the chair of the BBC last week, he wasn't aware of it, and I know that they have struggled getting a number of organisations in various different parts of the creative industries to sign up, including some of the streamers. What would your message be to those who say we have our own independent complaints procedure? There's nothing to see here, and we don't really want to be part of something which joins the creative industries together.
Well, I take a pretty dim view of that. It's not working. It's clearly not working. One of the things that has really concerned me is that when we've looked across the board at repeated instances of where people have spoken up, made complaints that have been swept under the rug, and it's only ended up in resulting in action when they've gone to the media, you can look at the inquiries into all of those occasions and every time the recommendations are the same. And yet here we still are with these things happening on a regular occurrence. Was it the chair of the BBC that you said wasn't aware of this? Well, that's astonishing because the BBC are one of the organisations that are supporting CISA, but I think that points to the fact that we have a job of work to do to make sure that organisations and senior people in organisations are aware of this. There are a number of streamers as well that are supportive, but I absolutely agree with the assertion that there should be more and they could do more.
Thank you. James.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, Secretary of State, Permanent Secretary. Just a quick sharpener to start off with, if I may. Reports in the news on a rise in anti-Semitism in the arts. Have you been briefed on this? Is it of concern to you when publishers and artists and writers are being described or having their work described as too Jewish?
Yeah,
what has that briefing led you to conclude?
I have been briefed about it. I am obviously very concerned about it, particularly the way in which the conflict in Israel and Gaza is playing out in the UK in a domestic context. There are obviously people who have heartfelt and very strong views on all sides. I've met with the families of the hostages, which was a heartbreaking meeting. I'm sure many of you have as well. I also met with some of the Palestinian families who've lost loved ones. And for many people in this country, it's personal. But what is never acceptable is when that results in a rise in anti-Semitism in our country and on the streets. And I am concerned about the way in which we've seen that playing out in the arts world. John Mann, Lord Mann, is shortly to host a round table for me with a number of organisations and artists who've been affected by this. And I'll be happy to update you further once we've had that round table.
Thank you. On the issue of the football governance bill, good to see its progress being made. In a touch of class by the former sports minister, Tracy Crouch, somebody I know we both admire, she called me the day she started her fan-led review to say that a lot of the prompt for this was through the heartache that fans in Bury had gone through, and other clubs have since endured similar trials. Do you think if the bill passes into law, it will prevent another no fan fault eviction from the National League like Bury had to endure?
I mean, that's very much the intention, and it was the intention behind the Crouch review, as you rightly said. I know that you were very instrumental in trying to save Bury FC when it was in trouble, and have been very instrumental in helping it to come back, which is, I have to say, I declare a personal interest. My stepdad was a lifelong season ticket holder there. His final words when he died in a Lancashire hospice a few years ago were, "What's the score?" Thankfully, he never lived to hear the answer. It's typically not good news. But it's, you know, these are clubs that are part of our civic inheritance. They stand at the centre of our communities. They have enormous economic significance, as you rightly pointed out. But they're handed down through generations of families. The chair of my supporters trust goes to, she went with her dad when she was little. She now takes her kids. Those kids will take their kids. They have much greater significance. The intention of the football governance bill is to make sure that we don't see a Bury FC again.
So I guess in terms of the application of the law that it will bring, is for us, the lower league, it's the backstop, to coin a phrase once familiar to this house in the Brexit years. This backstop is really about whether or not the fans get penalised for dodgy owners. And you can't, short of resetting and having new owners or putting existing owners through the fit and proper test that you're strengthening, you can't guarantee, can you, that lower league clubs won't fall foul of new legislation or new rules, but essentially the rogue owners that are in charge now in some instances would possibly bring their club to its knees like we had in Bury and elsewhere. What assurances can you give those lower league clubs that there is the backstop in place? Because there is, I think your minister has talked about an escalation of consequences. Yeah. Is there ever a consequence where the football club gets kicked out of its league?
Well, so the intention is to prevent that from happening and to make sure that fans don't pay a price for poor ownership. In Wigan we had similar issues, as you know, and thank you for all your help and advice in helping us to save the club. But we, the first thing is you need to make sure that you get better owners. The owner that put us in the position we were in wouldn't have got through the strengthened fit and proper persons test. The second is to make sure that you strengthen the voice of fans at every level, so that when day-to-day decisions are being made, fans are in the room, that they're aware of those issues, that they can blow the whistle early and make sure that they're dealt with. And then the final part of it is about making sure that there's a fair financial flow throughout the game. One of the challenges that we had in Wigan is that there aren't many local millionaires knocking about who want to buy a club. And so you are very reliant on owners who don't necessarily have the best of intentions. And so we want to make sure that that financial flow is much fairer. We don't want to do that ourselves as government. We want to incentivise the industry to do it. And I I would like to pay tribute to the work that Tracy Crouch did, because I think she has established a system that absolutely does that incentivises particularly the Premier League and the EFL to come together and reach an agreement without the need for the regulator to intervene. I don't know if you wanted to add anything.
Well, the only thing I was going to add is to state a self-evident point, we want to get on with the bill. So we can only do all these things once the bill's on the statute book, and that's the thing we're keen to see now.
Would the bill give, within the bill's purview, the removal of the ownership rights of the rogue owner, if proven rogue, to basically have that club taken off them?
So there is a power to look at current owners if new developments happen. What we've tried to do, and what Tracy tried to do in the previous government, is strike the right balance, so we're not creating uncertainty and deterring people from buying clubs. So it's a light touch regime. It's not intended to be heavy-handed. The backstop is intended to be a backstop. And if we get this right, and I'm confident that we will, there's a lot of support for this across the whole House, then what you will get is an ongoing conversation with the regulator to put issues right before you get to that point.
Thank you. On to artificial intelligence now. You prefer the opt-in model, the protection of creatives, as the champion of the creative sector around the development of AI and rights.
So these are conversations that I've been having very closely with my colleague Peter Kyle. As a government, we take the view that AI offers enormous opportunities for this country, for public service reform, for growth in the economy, and for the creative industries. But we also recognise that there are challenges that it poses to the creative industries, and we believe that it's in everybody's interests, both AI and the creative industries, that we have a proper system of regulation and legal certainty, so that we don't end up in the situation we're currently in, where these issues end up in the courts.
For the creatives, I mean, we talked at the beginning about a risk register the department has. For creatives, the top of that risk register is the threat posed by artificial intelligence, and a government attracted by and to the shiny thing on the hill at the expense of what we've all got, what we all enjoy, and everything else now. So they see it as pretty clearly opt-in is what they hope for, opt-out is what the speculation is the government's focusing on. So what assurances can you give the sector that give us everything we enjoy about the sector as of now, that we're not going to throw the baby out with the bathwater in pursuit of something that feels very exciting, maybe, very glossy, high energy, growth, but actually forfeits much of what we celebrate about the thing right now?
Well, let me reassure you first of all that we take very seriously the right of people to proper remuneration for their own work. We're a Labour government, we feel very strongly about that, and the Prime Minister set out that argument in a Guardian article a few months ago. We are about to consult on this issue, this specific issue. We're doing a specific consultation on AI and the creative industries. We've looked at legislation in other parts of the world, and in particular, we think the EU legislation offers too blunt an instrument for artists to properly protect them. And so we're about to go out to consultation, genuine consultation, to make sure that we can get this balance right. So, you know, if you're talking to people in the creative industries, please reassure them that there is no decision that has yet been made. We are determined to get the balance right. And we think if we do, we really could be pioneers in this and provide a model that other countries will want to follow.
Is there a risk, though, that the one department is clearly motivated, or should be, by the opt-in argument, and the other, with Chris Bryant in the middle, is motivated by the opt-out? How do you achieve that balance? Because it's a pretty binary argument that the creatives are making about what we need here.
Yeah, there is no split between our department and the Department for Science on this issue. We both both Peter, Carl and I see the enormous potential in AI, but we also see the risks to the creative industries, which are amongst our fastest growing industries, with the potential for good jobs and growth in every part of the country, almost uniquely, and that we've put at the heart of the industrial strategy. So we've got to get this right. We've got to do it together as a whole government approach, and that's why we've decided to do this very specific consultation on this discrete issue.
And when will that consultation be?
I want to say imminently, but I don't know if that's
soon.
This year?
Sorry.
Very soon.
This year?
Yeah, we know it's something that we need to get moving on.
Christmas?
And I think Chris Bryant is appearing in the Lords Committee this afternoon talking about AI. I mean, it is such an important issue, as the Secretary of State says, and we do spend a lot of our time, as I'm sure you do, and this committee has done some really good work on it, thinking about these issues. I think it's a very difficult but important area to make policy, because the sort of real world changes are happening so fast. So we do want to get on with that consultation and really encourage everybody to come forward with views on that consultation when it comes out.
Okay, my final point, rather than question, but you've not said whether it's opt-in or opt-out is your preference, and you've not given us any clarity on when, other than imminent. I'm sensing it's not this 2024, but can we expect it before Easter?
Certainly, we're not going to delay this, James. I would love to give you an early Christmas present. I can't give you a date at the moment. I'll definitely update the committee as soon as we, what we tend to do is update the committee in advance of major announcements. So we'll make sure in this case that we absolutely do that. And just to reassure you, we haven't developed a preference. We've looked at the limitations of similar legislation in the USA and the EU, and we have reservations about this idea that you can simply just say, I want to opt out, and then find that you have been completely erased from the internet. And so we genuinely haven't made a decision about the best way to go about this. And it's something that is top of the pile for Minister Bryant to deal with. As you know, he's got a particular passion in this area, and we will make sure that we don't delay.
And I hope when you see the consultation, it does cover a lot more than just opt-in, opt-out. It's the principles around transparency, around how some of the different subsectors of the creative industries might have different needs in response to AI. So hopefully it will give you a lot of what you want.
I appreciate that. That's good counsel. I would just say when it comes to the brass tacks of it, for the creatives, it's a pretty straightforward in or out.
Yeah. I mean, I have to thank you, James. I have to say I find it very hard to believe that you and the Secretary of State for Science and his department are in lockstep on this, because every bit of messaging that comes out of that department at the moment is that they have fully drunk the Kool-Aid on AI, and I think what we're looking for from our select committee is reassurance that you're going to be robustly standing up for the interests of our creative industries, because it is a zero-sum game, this. Any financial incentive for AI potentially risks losing a huge amount of everything for our creative industries.
Yeah, we're very alive to that, and of course it is my job to make sure that the voice of the creative industries is not just heard but acted upon in government. But what I would say to you is that, you know, as a new government, we do genuinely like each other, and we pick up the phone to one another and we talk about these issues a lot. Peter Cowell and I have discussed AI on a number of occasions. He's very sympathetic and alive to the concerns that the creative industries have, as I am to the possibilities that AI have, and we're determined to work together to get this right.
Okay, I think we'd probably like to hear him say those words a little bit more, if you do have a chance to pick up the phone to him.
I will mention that.
Jay.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to go back now to what you mentioned earlier, which is the Arts Council. And Chair, I'd like to just declare an interest, because I have submitted Arts Council bids whilst working with some of the creative industries in my previous job, which gave me that opportunity of working with the most amazing creatives during that time, but also see the issues that sometimes funding doesn't get to where it should. Yeah. The last government, obviously, they did a review, or were to do a review, which was stopped because of the general election. So I think I want to just try and find out, why was that decision taken to stop Dame Mary Archer's review into Arts Council funding?
for the very simple reason that we wanted to pause and reflect on whether that would address some of the issues that you just talked about, Joe. As I said earlier, I've been very concerned about the way in which arts and culture has become something that is often only accessible to young people whose parents can pay, because of its downgrading on the curriculum, and because in many parts of the country, as you know, unless you have something very, very local, the chronic problems we have with transport in large parts of the country mean that those things just aren't accessible. So in our neck of the woods, obviously Manchester's not very far away, but you often can't get a train home late at night after you've watched a show or gone to a gig, and so it's just not accessible for people. And so we paused. We haven't scrapped the review, but we hit pause, and we went away and did a piece of work looking at mapping out across the country where people have access to arts and culture, and who is consuming it, who is actually accessing that, and who is benefiting from it. We're shortly, imminently, I hesitate to say before Christmas, but that may or may not be the case, about to announce the chair of that new review. And when we do, we will then set out the terms of reference and the panel that will advise. What I really want us to be able to do is not just make sure that arts funding is enriching the lives of people in every part of the country, regardless of their background, but I also want to get us away from what I think is quite a deadening debate around between access and excellence. It has to be both. And the last review was very much framed around those two competing poles, when actually, if you look at the work that the Royal Shakespeare Company, for example, does, going into schools, doing spoken word work, they've got a rigorous system of assessment that shows that it helps young people with well-being, confidence, employability skills, the chances of being employed. It's top stuff, but it's also accessible to young people from all backgrounds. And so you'll see when we publish the terms of reference that we're very, very focused on that. I've also given a steer to the Arts Council that for the next round of the national portfolio organisations, I want them to do far more at working with local organisations to fund what is already there in communities to be able to grow and expand. My own experience of Arts Council funding is that too often people are brought in to do culture and arts to a place, and I think that's not had the benefits that communities would expect, and they're very open and amenable to that suggestion.
Okay, and is there scope and timelines on this? I know you've said you'll be announcing around Christmas, this side of Christmas, but is there any timelines for how long that process will take?
Yeah, well, there's a natural cut-off, isn't there, around the next round of national portfolio organisations will take place.
Yeah. So, well, I think the Secretary of State has been really clear with our teams that she wants this to be a thorough review and quite sort of broad. The ACE have announced 1-year extension so far. So what we want to do is make sure we're ready for the next one.
Yeah. So just give me the dates.
26, 27 is the extension year.
Yeah. So next year basically we need to conclude this review. We'll kick it off shortly, and we'll need to conclude it by the end of next year, I think is probably right to say. But if that changes, I'll let you know.
And I think just from my point, and again how we are informing all creatives, because a lot of this information doesn't necessarily sort of cascade down to where it needs to go.
Yeah.
Yes, the bigger institutions will obviously feed in, and that's what we usually see. But I think just to get down where, people need to submit basically because they need their say in this. I think that's a really important aspect of this. So
I think that's absolutely right, and it's interesting to hear you say that, given the Arts Council is based in Manchester, which is pretty much a stone's throw from Leigh. But if smaller organisations in Leigh don't know that support and funding exists, then we have got a problem. It's something that I'll take away and we'll have a proper look at to build that into the process. But if the committee has any suggestions, I'd really like this to be a genuine conversation and really welcome your help in making sure that we get this right.
Okay, perfect. And so Labour Party sector plan prioritised equality of access to arts and culture, which you've mentioned earlier. So, but what changes do you think are needed to enact that?
So there's a few things that we're looking at. Obviously, the Education Secretary has initiated the curriculum review, which as part of its aims puts sport, arts, culture, creativity back at the heart of the curriculum. And we're just working with Professor Francis at the moment to consider how best to do this. But our department is very involved in that conversation. I've met with her a number of times to make sure that we do that. The other thing that we're looking at is issues around who is accessing. So not just where you live, but who is actually accessing not just arts and culture, but sport as well. One thing that is particularly exercising me is when I was at the Paralympics over the summer, there was a campaign run by amazing Paralympian gold medalist Hannah Cockcroft about equal play. Only 1 in 4 young people in schools in England can access PE if they have a disability. That's 3/4 who can't. And there were lots of young people there with stories about how they were left in changing rooms surrounded by clothes while other children went off to do PE. I've already had discussions with the Education Secretary and the Health Secretary about how we change that. We are absolutely determined to change it. We think it's about teacher training rather than about a lack of willingness in schools to actually grip the issue. But we're looking at those sorts of things across the board to make sure that people are not prevented from accessing the arts because of their class, because of their where they live, because of their ethnicity, because of disability. It's something that is important to the Arts Council, but it's particularly important to us as a ministerial team.
Okay, and then again, sort of going back to the point that I made before, again, I think just with regards to the creative industry, that again, they'd probably feel that they get things done to them rather than being involved and having a stake in it. So how will you restore stakeholders' trust that ACE's funding decisions are completely independent of government?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that we want to be incredibly transparent about how we go about this, and they will have the opportunity to input into the ACE review so that by the end of it, our intention is that they will see their voices and their priorities reflected in what comes out the other side of that review, whatever reform we decide is necessary. I think the other thing to say is that, you know, both in myself and in Chris Bryant, you have people who are passionate supporters of the arts, and particularly around the role that the arts plays in holding up a mirror to society, in challenge to the status quo, even when that's uncomfortable for existing governments. That's always been part of the contribution, the huge contribution that the arts makes to this country. And I think you can see in the way that we're approaching government in the department with things like public appointments. We want those public appointments to look and feel much more like the nation itself. But we also are appointing and working with people across the political spectrum, people with a whole range of views. We want the best people. We want the broadest possible coalition. And that's the way that we're approaching the arts as well.
And can I just add something as well and just get your thoughts on this? Because again, you've mentioned working cross-department with education, health, obviously a huge aspect of this as well. And in particular, obviously with the creative industries, neurodiversity does play a part, which can be nurtured. And again, if you're talking from an education level, but how that reaches into health, is that something as well that the department's looked at?
Yeah, very much so. So we're working really closely across government. One of the benefits of mission-led government is that it does bring us together to work on shared priorities. And one of the things, just to go back to one of the questions that the chair asked about operating in a very difficult funding environment, is that through the next spending review process, we will be expected to put in joint bids as departments around shared priorities. One of the frustrations with the old way of working that I certainly felt during the last spending review process was that MHCLG were having conversations about cultural projects. the DFE were having conversations about cultural projects. We were having conversations with cultural projects, but the process simply didn't allow for those to be looked at in the round and for us to make joint bids. So we're very determined to change that. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm just going to echo it. And the plan for change was clear, for example, under the health mission about the need for focus on prevention, and that's a big area for us, exactly as you're saying. And it's been a real step change in terms of the ways of working. Also on the opportunity mission, as the Secretary of State was saying, we're working really closely with DFE.
Okay, and then I'm neatly going to go into same subject in a way, funding, but for sports and grassroots sports in particular. Again, I am going to blow Lee and Atherton's trumpet, a great sporting constituency, especially from a grassroots level. But again, the same issue applies. Sometimes funding doesn't get to where it's needed. So what are your plans to ensure that disadvantaged communities engage in community sports?
So I don't think there's any challenge for disadvantaged communities wanting to engage in community sports, but the issue is often the lack of facilities. So we've made that an absolute priority for the department. I announced a continuation of funding beyond what had already been allocated after the Euros, and we're really determined to do it. We've also got a particular focus on women and girls. We've got this Lionesses Fund. I recently visited an amazing facility, actually not far from you, in my constituency, Laithwaite Park, where they've built a changing room for the girls for the first time. And there are now more girls' teams than boys playing on those facilities, because that was the thing that was missing, that was stopping girls from being able to take up those opportunities. We're also looking across the board at things like issues around kit provision and, you know, some of those barriers that hold young people back from being able to participate, because it's not just about a place having those facilities, it's about the young people who live in that place being able to do so.
Yeah, I mean, we've done a lot on grassroots sports. I think this financial year, 559 facilities have received money right across England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. And I know this committee is going to look at grassroots sports, and I think it's a really important area. And as we look to the next spending review with other departments, we want to look across the piece at perhaps area provision, trying to think about not just pitches, but also...
Isn't this just old funding? It's a re-announcement of funding that has already been allocated.
123 million is in this year, so yes, that was allocated, but as the Secretary of State is saying, she's committed to money for next year, and in the business planning exercise that we're doing at the moment, we'll work out how much that is, but the plan is that the programme will continue.
Okay. So government has pledged 344 million, is it for over 4 years for the Olympic and Paralympic?
Yeah.
So what is the right balance between funding the elite sports, if you like, to grassroots sports?
Yeah, well, it's an ecosystem, and you'll know from the example of Keely Hodgkinson that you have to invest at grassroots level in order for great athletes to be able to come through, and then you've got to invest to make sure that they can continue to progress without financial hardship, and then to make sure that we can retain our medal position at the Olympics and Paralympics. And what that in turn then does is create a cycle that inspires more young people to want to get involved in sport. We always see a huge uplift in demand after major sporting events, whether it's the success of the Lionesses or the Euros or the Olympics and Paralympics. So we've got to do both. We've obviously got to do both in difficult financial circumstances, but the reason that I announced with permission from the Chancellor early, that ahead of the spending review, that we were going to uplift the Olympics and Paralympics funding for LA by 9 million is because, as you all know, it's very much a marketplace, that countries will compete for the best coaches, the best trainers, and if you don't invest early and you don't signal that intent early, you start to lose very good people. And so we're confident that by acting quickly and with the amount of funding that we've been able to commit, that we'll be in a really strong position for LA.
Okay, and just a tiny, just with regards to education and going back to working with the different departments, and I know obviously you outlined how that happens in the creative industries and sports. I think just a point for me to make, it is down to schools where we've seen a lot of success. happen, and I'm going to mention Keeley Hodgkinson and Ella Toon that went to the same school, is because schools allow. So I think just, again, that sort of cross-department work with education settings in how we enable that.
Yeah, and health as well. West Streeting is on the health mission, is on the education mission board as well, and the opportunity mission board. And we've already committed that as part of the curriculum review, we'll protect time for PE in schools. But like you say, it's often to do as well with the level of input that those young people get in schools, and particularly around disability. That's something that I'm really passionate about as improving.
A reminder for pithy answers, everybody, and pithy questions as well, because I know the Secretary of State wants to get out of here at a reasonable time. Moving on to Damien, please.
Thank you very much. Secretary of State, we've already talked about some of the cuts. Can I move on to the National Youth Strategy? So you announced this about a month ago, that it was going to be co-created with young people. You also announced at the same time the National Citizen Service would be cut altogether. Did you entertain the possibility that the co-creators might have wanted to keep the National Citizen Service?
Certainly, yeah. We, as I set out in the House when I came to the House to announce the National Youth Strategy and the decision around NCS, one of the things that I was keen to stress was that this was not an ideological decision. We know that NCS did very good work, and it had over 1 million young people through its doors, many of whom are very proud of what they achieved, and we respect that. But
wasn't just about saving money?
No, it wasn't. It was about how we spend money well in the current context. There was no youth strategy across government when we took office back in July. Different departments fund different things around young people. Most of the programmes that I inherited had been pet projects for various Prime Ministers, Secretaries of State and Ministers, of whom there have been many through the department in recent years. And I think it is absolutely undeniable that the challenges facing this generation of young people are getting worse, and there is an overwhelming sense amongst young people out in the country that government has not gripped them and is not providing the support that they need.
I think many people would agree with that challenges, issues for young people are certainly different from what they were when we were young, and in many ways more difficult. At the same time as announcing the co-creation of a national youth strategy, government also cut funding for the cadets programme. The Department for Education cut its funding for the school instructor programme. Did that strike you as being a particularly joined-up approach or particularly mission-led?
Well, look, what we're trying to do through the National Youth Strategy is make sure that we're really gripping the challenges facing this generation of young people. And
why cut the cadets programme?
And that means putting the right support in place. I cannot justify, for example, spending the vast majority of my department's budget for youth on a summer camp for young people when, as yesterday, when I've...
Cadets programme? You're calling the cadets programme
No, NCS. I'm talking about NCS, David.
We moved on to cadets. So at the same time as your department announced the National Youth Strategy, another department was cutting money from a very successful programme which was spreading cadet units through more state schools. Was that... You were talking about being joined up and having this mission-led approach, everyone working in tandem with each other, picking up the phone. Did that happen on that occasion?
Well, of course I had discussions with the Education Secretary about the areas of crossover between our departments. That wasn't our programme. It wasn't in my gift to decide what was prioritised and what wasn't. But the problem that we've got is that we inherited a disastrous economic situation with very poor public finances, very poor public services and a very high level of demand. And for young people in particular, yesterday I was at Empire Fighting Chance in Bristol listening to young women say they didn't feel safe to go out after 4 o'clock at night in case they were raped or sexually harassed. I listened to 12-year-old boys talking about people bringing knives to school so they didn't want to attend. And I listened to young people who talked about drugs being absolutely everywhere and an overwhelming feeling of hopelessness. Now, what we've got to do as a government, and what we have promised that generation we will do, is work right across government to make sure that when Liz Kendall is doing her Back to Work programme, that we are really investing in the things that will help young people to get those opportunities.
Some might say the cadets is such a programme, and the saving made by the DfE by cutting the instructor grant grant is barely more than £1 million, which in the context of the other programmes you're talking about, I'd suggest Secretary of State is not that much. Can I ask you about Young Futures Hubs? Yeah. So Young Futures Hubs, as we understand it, will bring together youth work, mental health, career services and others. You were talking earlier about work across government. I think in truth it has always been possible to put in joint bids between departments to spending reviews. The difficulty sometimes is just the management then of those programmes and the governance and the accountability. How do you envisage Youth Futures Hubs working?
So we've been working very closely with the Home Secretary on this and the Education Secretary as well. And you're right to say that the intention of Youth Futures Hubs is to bring together all of those things that young people want and need in one place. But we're piloting a couple of models around that, for which funding was provided in the budget. That will be overseen by the Home Office, by the Education Department and by my department as well. So the three of us working in tandem. But my department also has responsibility for youth clubs, of whom there are many around the country. And one of the things I've been discussing with the Home Secretary is that often the mistake that governments make is that they set up new initiatives in places where young people don't feel safe and don't feel that they belong. That's why I was at Empire Fighting Chance in Bristol yesterday, to see how they're using the power of boxing to get young people through the door. And once they start engaging, the conversation opens up and they're able to help them, mentoring them and helping them with all of those challenges that I just discussed. So we're hoping that that's how it will work, but we'll have a really rigorous system of evaluating those Young Futures Hubs to make sure that we're getting it right before we take any decisions about rollout.
Thank you. I'm conscious we need to pick the pace up. You mentioned earlier about the curriculum review and about creativity and sports, and of course all children should have a broad and balanced curriculum, including an opportunity to experience both being taught and to take part in the arts, in music and other cultural activities. We have an ambition of 2 hours quality PE a week and want children to be getting an hour of sport or activity every day. So when you talk about increasing emphasis on sport and the arts, is the intention to increase the length of the school day, or is the intention to remove something to make way for more of that activity? Well,
we haven't made any decisions or announcements around the length of the school day. The curriculum review that Professor Francis is leading for us will look at whether the curriculum is working well for young people. One of the things, for example, that I did recently was to go and look at some grassroots music venues in Ipswich with Ed Sheeran. I get ribbed endlessly by Minister Bryant because I mention this every time I go to any event. But it was, one of the things that a lot of the young people said to us there is that they're trying to work in the music industry. It's a growing industry. We're the third biggest exporter in the world, but many young people are put off from taking music GCSE because of the curriculum, because it doesn't skill them up to do those jobs. There has been an increase, of course, in children doing vocational qualifications in music, as you'll know. Yeah, but we saw a huge drop-off. We've seen a huge drop-off in the numbers of young people choosing to take arts, music, all of those subjects at GCSE, and we think we could do better. So we're going out, we're consulting, we're looking at the curriculum as a whole. We've already committed to protecting PE. Like you said, the last government was also very well aware of the value that PE in school can make to the lifetime of a child if you can get young people to start doing sport early. But we haven't got any plans to lengthen the school day. Let me ask you one quick question, if I may, on tourism, and then I think Rupa is going to follow up. So the government has an aim to increase to 50 million inbound visits by 2030. That's quite a hike from the position today. So I think that's about a
38 today.
From 38. So that's about a 25% increase. There's another way of looking at it, though, as well, which is if we were to, I did this maths very roughly, I hope it's about right, if we were to increase to proportionally the number of inbound visitors the Republic of Ireland gets per head of population, I think that number would go up to more like 80 million. So, but whether you aim for the 50 or the stretch target of 80, the big question is how? So it's an ambitious target, but it's one that we think that we can meet.
we have the top priority for me is addressing the skills shortages in the visitor economy. We've got a lack of capacity at the moment. We've got around 100,000 vacancies in the UK visitor economy, and so addressing those workforce shortages and creating a talent pipeline is a priority. It's why I was in Blackpool a few weeks ago looking at the work that the Pleasure Beach is doing in skilling up local young people to the most incredible jobs. You know, they've got design jobs, they've got mechanical engineering jobs, they've got all sorts of skills that are being developed there, and then those young people can go and work anywhere in the world. They tend not to. They tend to choose to stay and work here in the UK, and particularly in Blackpool. We're also setting up more local visitor economy partnerships. We've got 35 at the moment. They bring together local businesses to help increase spending in their areas, to really put rocket boosters under those areas of the economy, of those places, those communities that are currently growing. So there's a really exciting initiative going on up in Newcastle and Gateshead, where obviously the film industry is growing and they've got inward investment coming in. And there is an evaluation that is going to be published from that we'll look at very closely. Is there anything you wanted to...
No, and I think the only other thing is Chris Bryant is going to set up a Visitor Economy Advisory Council to try and bring together all the people that can help with exactly this. And as the Secretary of State says, I think we do see a link between the fantastic story of the creative industries and some of the inbound tourists wanting to come to different parts of the country.
I mean, I did in the local visitor partnerships and the higher level destination partnerships, I think they're called, are a good thing to try and rationalise this mishmash that we've always had. Ultimately, it's the marketing spend that's going to make the difference and how much of that can be harnessed. Just very quickly on skills, so there is no T-level in travel and tourism. There is one planned in catering, but there's no date yet for it to come in. There is a level 3 apprenticeship in travel consultancy. Skills has long been a big gripe in the industries, but the volume and numbers of people coming into the industry that you need, but also the skill level. I just wondered very quickly, and apologies to the Chair, very quickly, what is your vision for the future of level 3 skills development?
So I think that point about the absence of a T-level in tourism specifically is a good one, and I'll take that away and I'll come back to you on it, but I think that's a point well made. The apprenticeship levy we're also reforming to make it easier for the creative industries to access. Just in terms of the point that you made about marketing spend, I absolutely accept that. But just to return to the point that the Permanent Secretary just made, a lot of, one of the biggest reasons that people choose to come to the UK is because of TV and film, because they've seen Britain on screen and they want to come. So by supporting more distinctly British content and making sure that's seen across the world, we think we also contribute to the tourism strategy.
Okay, thank you. Rupa.
Yeah, my question sort of relevant to the tourism point is, how receptive are you to the argument for loosening entry requirements for kids on school trips? Because I remember I had a Westminster Hall debate on this under the last government, and before, we've all done it in reverse as well, school trip to France. They could come over on ID cards, but now, post-Brexit, there's this anathema to that, and they're meant to have passports and visas. It's not normal in their cultures, so we're stopping that soft power that you talked about. And then there's also the language schools. I've got a few in my seaside towns have loads. Kids would come, sixth formers in the holidays, maybe do a shift at a bar as well or in a restaurant or something. But all that has stopped, and we are losing that to countries like Ireland and even Israel, sort of other, and it's a huge loss. So I was always told, ask the Culture Department, you've got an Education Minister here, what do you think of this?
So I think the honest answer to that, Ruben, is that would be a conversation that I'll need to have with the Home Secretary. Obviously, she's got to consider the overall numbers of people coming to the UK. She's got to think about entry requirements and national security and balance that against our shared desire to make sure that Britain is an attractive destination for people to come and that we facilitate people to be able to come and spend money in our economy and experience British culture. I don't know if there's anything else you'd want to to add to
agree.
I do think the kids on a school day trip, they're 9 years old, they're not going to abscond and be an Uber driver, I personally think. So it's worth having a look at that again.
I will
All
have a
right.
look at I'll
Thank
look at
you.
the debate as well.
Okay, the main things I wanted to ask about were actually pop music, heritage and public service broadcasting. So ticketing, I asked you in the House what's happening with that. You said imminently. That was weeks ago. And I've got my own ready-made bill. We could join forces. I've had a lot of evidence from people. It's all there. I know the manifesto pledge was on resale, but there's also dynamic pricing. So when's it happening? And let's do this together, Lisa.
And you've got a private members bill on this, I think.
It didn't make it on Friday. I've got a new date, but there's a lot of expertise I could share with you.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of expectation out in the country as well. Certainly, the Competition and Market Authority, as you know, has announced that they're investigating Ticketmaster over the Oasis sale, which was one of the catalysts for this, although there are lots of parliamentarians who've been campaigning particularly on secondary ticketing for a long time. You'll know that the consultation that we're doing jointly with DBT, the Department for Business and Trade, is not consulting on whether we take action on secondary ticket pricing. It's how we take action on it to put fans back at the centre of the system. But we're also, as part of that consultation, going to look at dynamic pricing, to look at things like the surge model, where everyone's filtered into one system, which then increases demand, which then increases the price. We'll be looking at whether that's fair or there are fairer ways to operate that model. We'll also be looking at issues about transparency. So many of those people who were in that queue for Oasis tickets didn't know that the pricing was going to change, only to get to the front of the queue and find out that they couldn't afford the tickets. And that, I think, is a real source of anger for people.
By then as well. Yeah, do we know when it's happening? Because it was in the summer, then you said it'll be in the autumn, and you said imminently 2 weeks ago.
I did say imminently. Imminently does a lot of heavy lifting in government. I don't know if there's anything more we can say about the timing.
I think it's just soon. We're trying to get on with it.
Let's do this together. I'm happy to feed in
Lovely,
all the stuff
thank
I've
you.
got. Brilliant. Youth culture. I know there's actual questions on youth work, but mods, TEDs, hippies, ravers. It's a great British institution, and it's a multiple of things. What do you think of the argument that youth culture should be in the UNESCO Convention for the Safeguarding of Intangible Cultural Heritage? So there's this new thing that we can have intangible assets of cultural value. I think it should be in there. I wonder, as a Britney fan, if you're Britpop, it's all the same.
I'm not sure that Britney was ever part of youth culture, but it certainly isn't nowadays, right? I'll be completely honest with you. It's not something that I've given a lot of thought to, but I certainly will be happy to look at it.
Yeah, there's a museum of youth culture across the... We could do a trip there, across the river nowadays, so it's a good thing. And just in general, what is our timetable on this? The last government said that they would implement that convention. What's going on with that now?
We've ratified the convention, and I think we're then getting on with the consultation that follows on intangible cultural heritage.
Okay, order.
Saved by the bell.
questioner, who is Natasha.
Hi, thanks very much for coming. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the BBC and just ask some questions around that. And we know that charter renewal is coming up in 2027. And you've talked about having a BBC that so the public can feel the ownership of their national broadcaster and that reflects our country and everyone has a stake in. So we're just sort of wondering, how will you feed that into the charter review process, and what will you be looking for in that to sort of reflect the British public and our national stories?
Yeah, that's lovely, thank you. Well, first of all, we think that the BBC is incredibly important. It plays a unique role in British life, and both the Prime Minister and I are strong supporters of the concept of the BBC. But this committee did a report way back in 2015 which found that the licence fee model wasn't delivering the sort of sustained and stable funding that the BBC needs in order not just to survive but to thrive. And I think there has been a sense that every year, as we've approached the licence fee discussions, with fewer and fewer people now paying the licence fee, and the challenges in the world being so great, that there's always an ongoing discussion about the world service, and successive governments, including ours this year, have had to step in with additional funding to help safeguard those programmes. And we think that is unsustainable. So we intend to start the charter review process in order to not just think through the operation of the BBC and how it thrives for the next 10 years, but well into the latter half of this century. And I've taken the decision, therefore, to disband the work that was being done on BBC funding, in particular by the last government, and roll that into the Charter Review so that we have that discussion together. I think one of the conversations, I've already started those discussions with the BBC. So I had my first formal meeting with the Director General a few weeks ago to kickstart that process. We're planning to start early in the new year, and the review will have to be completed by the end of 2027.
Yeah, that's when the charter ends.
I would very much welcome the input of this committee into that conversation about the sustainability of BBC funding, about the operation of the BBC, about the way in which it doesn't just commission from outside of London, but it moves power outside of London as well, so that the people who are deciding what story is told come from a very diverse range of places and backgrounds, and how we protect things that are incredibly important but not particularly profitable, like regional television, like children's television, and like the BBC World Service as well, as part of that process.
So, sorry, just in the rush of getting back from votes, I should declare an interest. I used to work for a public service broadcaster before coming to Parliament. So just then, you mentioned that you'd discontinued the funding model review, and you're rolling it into the charter review process. So then, do you think that then you're thinking about reforming the licence fee more than replacing it?
So no options are off the table, both in terms of the BBC's operational structure and funding models. I know this committee did some work a few years ago looking at different funding models and concluded that there were downsides to every one of them. We're not in the business of reform for reform's sake, but I think in the early discussions that I've had with the BBC, it's clear that there are limits in terms of the amount of money that the BBC can raise from commercial sources, particularly with its obligations as a public service broadcaster, which we believe are incredibly important. So we are going to have to think in the broadest sense about the options around funding and structure, and nothing is off the table.
I suppose the impact on the wider sector, if the BBC suddenly can, start running advertising, for example, is going to have a massive impact on the commercial sector, and might have unintended consequences there. So we'd be looking in the round at the wider impact on the sector, not just on public service broadcasters.
Very much. So, one of the things about the BBC is that wherever you go in television and the creative industries as a whole, the BBC has usually played some kind of role in the success of those other institutions. It's an incredibly important part of the ecosystem. And so any reform to the BBC has major impacts on the whole sector. And of course, we'll consider that very carefully as part of the charter review process.
I mean, we had Richard Sharp here a few weeks ago, and he described the licence fee as regressive. So will we be thinking about how we can perhaps make the licence fee fairer? Would those discussions sort of happen?
As I said before, nothing is off the table. One of the things that we have already done is that in the first week that I was appointed, I asked for a report from the BBC about non-payment of the licence fee and prosecutions. You'll know that 75% of those who end up prosecuted are women, often very vulnerable women. That can't be right in a system that is fair. I know it's something that the BBC takes seriously, but one of the things that we've done is extend the simple payment plan so that people can pay in stages, so they can pay every 2 weeks or every month rather than having to find that one-off cost every year, which will double the number of households who are eligible to be able to do that. But in terms of the wider reform to the BBC, nothing is off the table.
And then just to go sort of circle back to what you mentioned about the role of this committee, you know, how can we be helpful in that charter review process? Because I'm sure all of us want to play our role in that. So what would be helpful?
So there's a formal process that we have to follow as part of the charter review negotiations, and the Permanent Secretary is very helpfully just waving a piece of paper in front of me that explains that. But I asked for a briefing from officials about this because we have to consult with Parliament, and obviously this committee is the key means through which we will consult with Parliament. As I understand it, during the last charter review process, this committee was heavily involved from the outset. We're intending to have a national conversation. We want to bring people's voices into that conversation. One of the key aims for the charter review for me is how people feel that the BBC belongs to them and genuinely reflects their lives. Because in order for it to go on and thrive, people have got to really be behind it as a national broadcaster. So we're going to kick off a national conversation about that, but I would be really grateful if the committee would agree to be involved from very early stages so that we can take advice. And also I know that you've done a lot of reports and inquiries into some of these issues that it would be helpful for us to be able to consider.
I'm just going to do a completely different topic now. It has come up through different members, but I'm quite keen to dig a little bit deeper into school sport and how the curriculum review will play into that. And as has been said before, the previous government committed to 2 hours per week. Do you think that should be something that is a statutory requirement and we should just bake that in?
Well, I think as Damien was making the point earlier, that when you protect time on the curriculum, you remove two things. You remove other things, because not everything can be a priority, but you also remove flexibility for the teaching workforce to be able to look at the children in front of them in the classroom and make a decision about what they would best respond to and what best meets their needs. So I think this is a balance that we've got to strike. The Education Secretary and I have been very clear that sport, arts, creativity is going to get more prominence in the curriculum. But beyond that, we haven't made any decisions while the curriculum review is still ongoing.
And then just finally, you had a letter from Sir Mo Farah around school sports and the important role that it plays in young people's lives. So what would you like to see from the curriculum review in terms of ensuring that all children from whatever their background have access to sport, but particularly through school, not just through clubs that maybe might be a bit expensive that parents can't kind of get involved in? So what do you want to see from the curriculum review, and how do you think that can help make that happen? So
I had the pleasure of meeting Sir Mo Farah recently. We did a few laps up and down Downing Street, which I won. No, a joke, I didn't really. It was. He's an incredible campaigner on this issue, and he talked very movingly and passionately about how sport saved his life. As a teenager coming to the UK in such horrendous circumstances, it was running that really transformed his life and got him to where he is today. And we want that opportunity for every child, whether it's sport, whether it's music, whether it's dance, whether it's drama. We want every child in this country to have something that matters to them, that belongs to them and helps to sustain them through tough times. We're doing a particular piece of work, as I mentioned to Joe earlier, about disability and looking at how we can make sure that young people with disabilities can play a full part in school sport. Like I said, we think that's about teacher training, and we've been working very closely with the NEU, trade union and others to see, and specialist disability providers to see whether we can extend some of those sports for disabled people into schools. So, bringing in wheelchair rugby into schools and having all young people being able to have a go and to participate. It's quite tough, but in terms of the level of athleticism that you need in order to participate. But we think that will really help. The other thing that we're doing is we're looking at we're working with MHCLG to look at facilities out there in the community as well, because often young people get a taster of sport at school, but then they want to go on and to develop it. And obviously with the cuts to council funding over the last 14 years, what's often happened is that leisure centres have disappeared or sports facilities have closed down in the community. So we're working with MHCLG to see what more we can do to make sure that in every part of the country there is access to some kind of multi-use facility so that young people can explore those passions out of school.
Thanks very much, Paul.
Thank you. And I declare my interest as a member of the National Union of Journalists and a member of the Dale Supporters Trust. I'll get that out there first. Now, many staff at The Guardian and The Observer were very angry last week when the board of the Scott Trust and the Guardian Media Group agreed in principle the sale of The Observer to the Tortoise Media. That was despite calls for more time for the deal to be considered and despite other rival bidders not being considered. Now, they worry about the long-term future of Britain's oldest Sunday newspaper and one of the few progressive newspapers left in the UK. Your predecessor was sufficiently worried about the public interest involving the Telegraph last year that she issued a public interest intervention notice. What concerns, if any, do you have about the public interest implications of this sale?
I'm afraid on this issue, I am going to have to recuse myself from answering because I have a quasi-judicial role as the Secretary of State. I am the single decision maker when it comes to decisions about whether to exercise the power that you mentioned and how to then respond to the information that I receive. So I'm prohibited in law from talking about... I take
that completely, but can we talk about the principle then? When considering the potential sale of any newspaper, what factors do you take into account when you're assessing the public interest?
I'm going to just turn to you for a bit of advice here about how to navigate this. I want to make sure that I don't fall foul of the law.
Yeah, I think it's better not to get into the specifics around
I'm not asking you about
case.
specifics
Under
now,
the
but
enterprise,
the principles, what are the principles that guide you when it comes to the public
under
interest?
the Enterprise Act, there are certain criteria for public interest test, and those would be the sorts of things that the Secretary of State would be looking at. But as she said, I don't think we should get into any specifics on these press mergers.
Paul, in terms of how we want the media landscape to operate, which I think is sort of what you're talking about. Plurality is obviously a really important principle. We want to make sure that there are a range of views and voices that can be heard. One of those elements is obviously national media, but there's also local and regional media as well, which I'm particularly exercised about. And I'm shortly about to have land on my desk terms of reference for our local media strategy, which we intend to kick off early in the new year to make sure that we do have that range of voices reflected in our local and national conversations as we devolve far more power to communities and to regions. It's absolutely essential that there's the ability to hold that power to account, and we've seen far too many local and regional publications collapse in the last few years. So plurality is the thing that I am most focused on.
Yes, but also transparency. I mean, the principle of transparency, do you think the public deserves to know who are the financial backers of any proposed takeover of a national newspaper?
Well, the regime that we currently have puts some information into the public domain, but not all information into the public domain. As you know, it might be helpful for you to sort of explain that a bit further.
I think the Enterprise Act is clear about the public interest considerations, and that is what the Secretary of State would look at. We also have just launched a consultation on expanding the legislation around media mergers to include online news publications. But that's the regime that we would look at in any such case as this one.
Can I ask you about the Football Governance Bill?
Yeah.
The Permanent Secretary quite rightly said we want to get on with the bill. Do you have a message to those Conservatives peers who are filibustering the bill right now?
Yes, I do, actually. I think this has been a very thoughtful piece of work by Tracy Crouch through the fan-led review that fans across this country have taken seriously and engaged in. Too many fans have been in the situation, like James's constituents, like mine, of seeing their clubs either collapse or be on the verge of collapse with no tools or powers to effectively be able to do anything about that. And this is a bill that has had cross-party consensus for a long time. It was a manifesto commitment from this government, and it is high time that we got on with it. It is not acceptable to use parliamentary procedures to try to block a piece of legislation on which so many hopes and dreams rest, that was clearly something that we committed to before the election, and which my counterpart Stuart Andrew and the Conservative front bench fully support still. So my message would be we need to get on with this for the sake of football and out of respect for the fans.
You mentioned rightly it's cross-party, but it was also fan-led. But while the bill requires the football regulator to consult with clubs, with officers, with owners and with people who organise competitions, it's no requirement to consult with fans or players. Would you consider looking at giving fans a consultation role?
Yeah, so we fully recognise the importance both of, obviously, of fans. Part of the intention of the bill is to put fans at the heart of the game, but also of players. And this is something that I've discussed recently with Baroness O'Grady. I think she's a baroness, I'm not sure, but over in the other place. In the bill, the regulator has statutory duties to consult such persons it considers appropriate before taking certain actions, and we would expect that to include consulting the players and or the players' union, the PFA, and obviously we would expect fans to be at the heart of that conversation.
Right. Now, research in 2023 stated that although 44% of Premier League and 34% of English Football League players were black, just 4% of managers are black. That's a massive gap. Dwight York has said, we want just fairness. I sometimes feel we have to do 3 or 4 times more before you get an opportunity. Now, when it comes to Football Governance Bill, there's a welcome reference to equality, diversity and inclusion for the first time, unlike the previous incarnation of this bill. But wouldn't it make more sense to give EDI prominence as one of the key objectives of a football regulator?
So I can take that away and look at it. I think those figures that you just gave are really shocking. Yesterday I was in Bristol doing an event with the historian David Olashuga about representation in the creative industries. And it was a very similar story that he painted of it being far easier to succeed if you are from an ethnic minority background in front of the camera than it is behind the camera. And when you get behind the scenes and you get to the place where power actually lies, the ability for people to break through is so much harder. So that is certainly something that I'll take away and have a look at.
And finally, can I ask you about women's football? We all talk about the football pyramid with the Premiership sitting at the top, but there's a real risk that this bill becomes the football pyramid of geezers because there's no mention of women's football in it at all. Wouldn't it make sense to include the women's game in the regulator's State of the Game report?
So we looked at this, and as did the previous government, and we think that at present it's not the right decision to include the women's game in the bill. But it is obviously something that we'll keep under consideration as the women's game develops.
Yeah, that's right.
If you include it in the State of the Game report, that's one way of doing it. It doesn't mean you fully include it in the bill, but it's one way of making sure you raise the subject.
Yeah, one of the things that we have done is the bill now adds the women's professional leagues to the list of persons to whom the regulator may disclose information. So we have strengthen the provision around that, but let me take that specific point away and have a look at it.
Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Paul. I'm just going to quickly swing back to Rupert to finish off one of your questions, please.
Yeah, the British Museum is under your bailiwick. I just wondered, do you think it accurately reflects kind of what people want to see? And I think some are quite alarmed that there's actually no acknowledgement of the British role in the transatlantic slave trade at all in there. And there is a campaign by the Good Law Project at the moment called No Room for Slavery at the British Museum. Isn't that something under-acknowledged that should be there?
So I've had
a permanent exhibition, ideally.
So I've had a number of meetings with the British Museum since I was appointed to this post, and it's one of Britain's most valuable institutions. I am a strong supporter of it. It's the most visited attraction for people who visit Britain. I think 1 in 8 people visit the British Museum. So it plays a really significant role in our national life. And I think it handles difficult issues, including the light and shade in our past, in a very thoughtful way. I can certainly take the issue of slavery away and have a look at it, Rupa, but what I would also say is that for me, one of the things that I've really prioritised in those talks with the British Museum is how we extend the very good work that they're doing to make sure that those collections are out of the basement and into our communities. We're also doing a similar piece of work with the government art collection. Obviously, there's an expense attached to it. It costs money to transport artwork and items, but we think that, you know, these are national institutions and collections. They belong to the nation, and everybody should have the chance to see them.
Yeah, and on that point of spreading things around, I totally get that it can't just all stay in central London. Can I have a plea for suburban London as well? Yeah. We always feel hard done by because everyone assumes London means the streets are paved with gold in the city centre. And I remember raising to one of your predecessors a company that I have in Acton that used to supply lighting and sound gear to shows all over the country. They were supplying an ITV programme in Brighton, a detective show called Grace. And then the Nadine Dorris sort of anti-London whatever level stuff came in, and they weren't allowed to anymore. So that company, that show had to get their gear from Manchester, which I know you're a Manc MP, but it was a lot of hassle, emissions maybe, just the whole logistics of it. And that company, I have to say, I raised it before. When you're a small company, you've only got a number of suppliers. They went under 2 weeks ago. So it's a serious thing for suburban London businesses. So just a plea to you, can you not see things in a black and white London anti-London way like the last government did?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll give you that commitment. I think one of the threads that runs through what we're trying to do is to make sure that people, and young people in particular, have opportunities wherever they live. And I am acutely aware that if you live in outer London, those institutions can feel as remote to you as for a child growing up in Wigan. And so, you know, whether it comes to contracting and supporting the local economy, or it comes to those collections and young people being able to access them, we certainly aren't assuming that people in London have those opportunities at the moment. We know that we need to do work to make sure that it reaches every community.
I think Netflix doesn't have to do that. It's because ITV's a public service broadcaster. So yeah, if you can do it on those things, it'd be much better. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks. I'm so glad you get it. Brittany, everything.
Thanks, Rupa. Zoe.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. So I've got a couple of questions on the video games industry and then over to the charity sector. So we know that things have changed for the gaming industry post-pandemic. We saw this big surge, but now, of course, there's some more challenges that the industry is facing. What is the government doing, very briefly, to help the industry through these challenges?
So we see video games as one of the absolutely central planks of the industrial strategy and of our growth story. And there's some amazing, as you know, success stories. I have to say that when my 9-year-old found out I got this job, he doesn't really like sports. And he doesn't watch a lot of TV like a lot of kids. He's on YouTube most of the time. But when he and his friends found out that I was in charge of video games, I was the hero of the school playground. So we see it as a tremendously valuable part of the economy. And you'll know that we have the UK Games Fund. We've confirmed funding for that now up until March 2026, and then we're obviously going through a round of business planning in the department about priorities going forwards. But for me, investment in video games and helping startups to succeed is a priority. And the other thing that we are aware is imminent is that UKI, which is the industry body, are doing some research about the competitiveness of the UK video games tax reliefs since we introduced them. Obviously, many other countries have done the same. That's obviously something that I'll need to discuss with the Chancellor when that report is published, but we will look very closely at those recommendations.
Thank you. And it's interesting you touch on the sort of around the tax relief. I think that's really important because one of the challenges that games companies are talking to me about for my own constituency is the challenges they face in terms of competing with countries in other countries when it comes to the video gaming industry. So I'd be really interested to hear more on that from you. But also one of the things they talk about when I talk to them is they really want to invest in UK talent, the young people that are coming out of schools and universities. But one of the challenges is that young people are not coming out with the relevant skills for what is needed for the constantly evolving sector. We've obviously got the curriculum review. So I guess my question is, what are you doing as a government as part of the curriculum review, but also with higher education facilities to ensure that those skills are there? And are you talking to the industry and companies themselves?
Yes, so we are talking to the industry and companies, and it's an issue that they've raised with both myself and Minister Bryant. And we're considering that at the moment as part of the curriculum review. I was also very interested in what Damien was saying earlier about T-levels, and I think we need to look at both GCSEs and T-levels together to make sure that, and A-levels together, so that we make sure that we're finding the right route for young people to get them the skills that they need to work in what we hope is going to be a hugely growing industry.
And I hope that part of that will also be apprenticeships as well, and supporting companies to have those apprenticeships. Yeah,
absolutely. So we've already had some of those discussions with the video games industry, specifically around the reform of the apprenticeship levy. One of the challenges that we've had is that it didn't work brilliantly for the creative industries as a whole, and so we've been working with them to make sure that we get that right, so that we're helping to fill those skill shortages.
Fantastic, thank you, I really appreciate that. And so just turning my thoughts to the charity sector, again, post-pandemic, things have been really challenging for the charity sector. And there was some really concerning, I'd be interested to know what you think, figures around the fact the UK has dropped to 22nd in the world when it comes to giving, and that makes it its kind of joint lowest ranking. Does that concern you?
I came from the charity sector before I was elected to Parliament 14 years ago. I was at Centrepoint and then the Children's Society, and I am a huge supporter of the role that charities play in the UK. I think they faced a double whammy over recent years because, as well as funding decreasing, they've also seen a huge rise in demand, and there are lots of examples of charities just having to step in and do the bare minimum when what they actually want people to do. What they want to help people to do is to thrive. So an example in my constituency, which Joe knows very well, is the Brick, which was a homelessness charity. It now is better known for being a food bank because the level of need was so great that they have had to focus very much on that. I think what we want to do as a government is support them both by addressing some of those challenges that the people that they support are dealing with as a government, so making sure people can get access to healthcare, improving living standards, but we also want to support charities through a better partnership with not just national but regional and local government as well. We used to have regional development agencies that were abolished by the last government. Civil society had a seat at that table, and so they had a very strong voice in helping to shape the systems and processes that then affected them. The abolition of those RDAs, and I say this not to make a political point, but it meant that that voice was removed and they were often picking up the pieces after decisions had been made. That's why we've launched the Civil Society Covenant, because we want a better partnership where we're bringing them in early to help inform not just what we do, but what mayors and councils do as well.
Thank you. And on the Covenant specifically, there's kind of two parts to this question. One is, do you think that is going to lead to a national philanthropic strategy? But also, I just want to sort of give a plug for organisations like Guildford Philanthropy and many of those organisations across the country who have expertise and experience in getting giving up and running and increasing giving in their areas. Are you going to be speaking to organisations like that to kind of build on that expertise they have?
Yes, so we obviously have the gift aid system, which is one of the most generous in the world, and we're strongly committed to keeping that. We've also, I've asked the department to work up a place-based philanthropy strategy. I've been really struck by some of the work that the previous government did actually in some parts of the country, like Grimsby, for example, or in Stoke. What you've often got is people who come from that community. They may not live there anymore, they may be part of the diaspora community, but they feel very strongly about the place that they grew up. They want those opportunities for people who come after them, and they're far more likely to give for their place than they would be otherwise. So we're working up a place-based philanthropy strategy. I've been doing a bit of work with the Chief Secretary to the Treasury on impact investment. I don't know whether it's worth saying a bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think we feel that across the whole giving spectrum, from philanthropy at one end right through to something that looks a bit more like a market investment product, there is appetite. And so the Secretary of State and the Chief Secretary did a round table with a whole range of financial institutions through to more philanthropic experts, and we're going to bring forward some work on that, which was also announced in the budget.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Zoe. Tom.
Good afternoon. I'd like to ask some questions around prominence and public service broadcasters, but first should refer to my register of interests, including hospitality from Channel 4, and additionally having received hospitality from the BBC, as well as chairing the BBC APVG and being a former employee of the Prospect and Bec2 trade unions. That's the question. Chair of the BBC has warned that the prominence of public service broadcasters on smart TVs is now at risk. What are the challenges for ensuring prominence for the PSBs on TVs and on the range of devices that audiences now use to access TV content?
Yeah, so obviously we had the Media Act, and we and Ofcom are now in the process of implementing the Act, and things are broadly on track with that. So Ofcom's roadmap was published earlier this year. It delegates certain powers, as you know, Tom, to me and to Ofcom in terms of designing in-scope services and developing guidance. We have to carry that out before the provisions in the Act can be commenced, and it does mean that we'll need a bit more time to engage with stakeholders to make sure that we get that right. But we have met with Ofcom 4 times since Royal Assent, and we're expecting to meet again shortly. We are aware of how critical this need for prominence is, and to get that right, it's something that we inherited from the last government, but we're very determined to take forward. I don't know if there's anything that you wanted to add.
You said it all.
Okay.
It's broadly on track. Are you satisfied that Ofcom have struck the right balance between taking time to consult on the new prominence regime and the need to bring that new regime into force, given the pace of technological change?
I think broadly, yes. I mean, we're operating in a very fast-moving, fast-changing environment, and across the board, particularly for Ofcom, they often find themselves at the sharp end of that in terms of regulation. And they are aware, as expressed to me in those meetings that I've had with them since I was appointed, of the need for pace. But they're also aware that every decision that they take comes under intense scrutiny, and that system has to be right. And I am broadly satisfied that we're getting the balance right between moving at pace and getting the system right. Would you share that?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think they laid out their roadmap earlier in the year, and it sets out all the different parts of that Act and how they will consult and when the codes will come in and then when they'll be fully effective. But as the Secretary of State says, I think there's always a balance to make sure that we've got really robust regulation in place. But we know the strength of feeling in the PSBs. They really want prominence, and this committee has been clear about that.
Thank you. And turning to another challenge, particularly for the commercial PSBs, what impact does the government think that the ban on less healthy foods will have on commercial public service broadcasters, and do you have any plans to try and mitigate that impact?
So we think we've got the balance right between allowing advertising, which is of course incredibly important for the TV industry and for commercial broadcasters, including public service broadcasters who advertise. In a very challenging environment where advertising revenues have fallen, and particularly during the pandemic, there was a huge knock-on effect to the TV industry, and the need to protect children. We've got a real health challenge in this country, and I think, like the last government, we feel that this does strike the right balance to make sure that we're protecting children without causing harm to the industry. They have had quite some time to consider that we're doing this. There have been a lot of conversations about the guidance, about how this works, and so they've had quite a lot of time to prepare. I know it's something that is of concern to them, but I think in government you have to get the balance right, and we think that in this case we have.
Do you think there's a risk that there's a direction of travel of banning different kinds of advertising, whether that's for commercial PSBs or other commercial broadcasters, that eventually you sort of reach a situation where those that are no longer able to, and advertising revenues will fall even further for...
I mean, in theory, of course you could. In practice, there was a huge debate about whether to bring in these measures. Our government, and I think the previous government, has had a lot of conversations with industry about it. There's been a national debate around it. I think governments don't take these actions lightly. We're acutely aware of the pressures on TV. It's important. And so I think in theory, yes, but in practice, no.
And I guess trying to show some of that balance myself, moving on to physical activity, you talked a little bit about being on 4 of the 5 mission boards. DCMS leads on sport policy, but no single department can drive the long-term change needed on physical activity. So how are you making the case across government to ensure that physical activity is getting the attention it deserves? When he was appointed, the Health Secretary said that 75% of the work that is needed to help him meet the health mission is outside of his department and his remit. And so much of it is in ours, but it's also in the Department for Education and right across government. I recently met with the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions to discuss the Back to Work strategy before it was published. And one of the elements of that is about sports being the way in which you can engage with young people who are furthest from the workplace, and being able to help them get the skills that they need in a place that they feel particularly comfortable in. So I think this is a government that is taking that incredibly seriously, and the missions help us work together across government. As I said, for the forthcoming spending review, we'll be making joint submissions, and I would be astonished if we weren't making joint submissions around sport in particular and healthier lifestyles.
And also I think the culture and sort of mental health benefits from culture and the arts as well fits into the prevention agenda, doesn't it?
Yeah, so one of the things we're looking at is the Essex model, where you co-locate health services with sporting facilities. We're also looking at Empire Fighting Chance, the Bristol model, where they are using the power of sport to then engage with young people about other issues, including mental health and well-being. And I've had very early discussions with Rugby League as well about whether there's something that we could do with them to help in those parts of the country where men in particular are struggling with mental health, to use the power of sport to be able to have those wider health benefits. So it's something that is very much top of our priority list.
Thanks, Tom. Just on rugby, actually, can I just ask you, the RFU have suffered record-breaking losses and they've made staff redundant, but their top executives are taking home eye-watering bonuses. Do you agree and share the concerns of voices like Martin Thomas, Graham Cattermole, Brian Baster, that a rugby union needs sweeping change right at the very top?
It is something that so the sustainability of rugby union is obviously something that we are looking very closely at, and I've had some discussions, as has Minister Peacock, with the industry body to talk about what more we might do. I haven't looked at that particular issue, to be honest, Caroline, but I will take that away and get the department to have a look at it. I think it's definitely worth us considering. Do you agree?
Yeah.
Thanks. And can I also take you back quickly to talking about PSBs? Skydance have taken over Paramount, which means that Channel 5 is obviously one of our public service broadcasters is now under new ownership. Have you discussed the impact of this with Channel 5 or Ofcom?
I'm due to be meeting Channel 5, I think, shortly.
Yeah, and also we see Ofcom very regularly, so
yeah, so it's definitely something that will be on the agenda.
Thank you. Last but not least, Liz.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Secretary of State. Turning back to sport, what is the government doing to ensure that the British public will be able to watch the sporting events it wants to on free-to-air TV?
So we think that we've broadly got the balance right at the moment in terms of listing, but we are aware that there are potentially issues coming down the line about streaming. And we're looking very closely at that as a department. We want to get the balance right so that we make sure that we sustain sporting revenues that are invested in the sport and help them to thrive, but we open up our big public events to as many people free to air as possible. We think broadly that is right at the moment, but we're aware that we may be about to hit a bigger challenge that will mean that we'll need to potentially take a different approach.
So how do we help UK public service broadcasters to compete with the global media companies for sports rights if they cannot compete on budget?
Well, it is a challenge. It's certainly a challenge that we recognise. But there are a number of public service broadcasters who've been able to win rights. And the deal that has been done around the Olympics is an example of where, you know, because under the current regime, we have at least one of those channels must be offered the opportunity to air events as part of that deal, even if the actual contract has been done with a streamer. We do think that provides protection for the public. But I agree with you that it is it's a broader challenge for public service broadcasters about competing with streamers. And one of the things that we're acutely aware of as we begin the BBC's charter review is that we need to take account of that very challenging environment and that completely transformed landscape, even from just a few years ago when we do that.
And the last government commissioned a review to assess if digital rights should be included within the listed events regime, but took no action. Are you aware of it, and are you willing to legislate on this?
Do you want to?
Well, I think, this was something we debated under the last government and as part of the Media Act, and as you say, it didn't come through, but we exactly as the Secretary of State says, are keeping an eye on it.
You've mentioned the Lionesses a few times. Do you agree with the view that the Saturday 3 p.m. blackout slot is the best time to broadcast women's football?
I think these things are always very contentious. Every single fans group that I've ever met has a very strong view about that. Obviously, football has to balance the need for global audiences with the need for fans to be able to attend and participate. And, you know, in some ways, football is challenged by its own success because not just men's football now, but women's football is watched and loved all over the world. And it is a tricky balance to get right. We think the Football Governance Bill will help in that by strengthening the voice of fans. We'll make sure that fans are part of the conversation so that they aren't just brought in as an afterthought. It's something that actually some of James's constituents raised with me when I visited Gig Lane on my first visit as the Secretary of State. So we think these are tricky decisions for them to get right. It's not something that we think the government should impose, but by putting fans back at the heart of the conversation, we think we may be able to get a fair settlement.
But would you make the case for it with the Premier League, EFL and the FA?
Well, it genuinely depends on the balance between protecting revenues to making sure that we can still produce top-flight football in this country and making sure that fans are at the centre of the game. So it's something that I've discussed with all of those bodies that you just named. But that it is a challenge for them because they have to strike the correct balance.
What do you want to see happen to raise the profile of women's sport?
Well, I think the Lionesses are already doing a very good job at raising the profile of women's sport. I think that the job of government is to make sure that all of those young girls who looked onto their screens and saw young women who came from their own communities, who look and sound like this country, who are ordinary people who've gone on to do extraordinary things, I think our job is to take those dreams and give them a plan to match them. And that's why we announced the extension of the grassroots facilities funding after the Euros, to make sure that we can do that. We've got a particular focus on women's sport as part of that, haven't we?
Yeah, that's right. I think there have been 14 new facilities specifically for women and girls sports, and to try and make sure once they're open that they have access at the times that they want. I think also the Minister for Sport has just convened a roundtable on women's sport, looking at some of the things that Karen Carney obviously set out in terms of football.
Yeah, one of the challenges, as you know, is that a lot of girls often get the later slots on. They don't get. So just as we were talking about prominence with the public service broadcasters, you also have this issue where girls are often last in the queue to be able to get access to facilities, and the Minister is very keen that should change.
Thank Thank you. And finally, if I could just turn back to charities and financial sustainability of charities. Data from the voluntary sector shows that charities are facing increased demand for services at the same time that costs are rising, staff are being cut, and demand for grant funding is reaching unsustainable levels. What will DCMS do to help the sector?
So the first thing that we did was we hosted the sector, representatives of the sector in Downing Street for a round table and a reception with the Prime Minister to discuss how we form a better partnership with the charity sector. Under the last Labour government, we had a civil society, I want to say compact. Yeah. It's testing my memory now. I was in the charity sector at the time, and we had a compact that was led by the Office of the Third Sector that helped to ensure that charities were in the room when decisions were being made that affected them, and ensured that they were very much at the heart of government. We're calling it a covenant this time round, because one of my reflections on that as somebody in the voluntary sector is that it was more like a contract than a genuine partnership, and I think ultimately that's why it didn't survive. We're also obviously thinking in terms of funding about how we can best protect charities. I know that the decision around employer national insurance contributions was very challenging for a lot of charities, and Minister Peacock has had a number of roundtables with the sector to discuss this and how we mitigate the impact, including the decision that we made to increase the employer NICS rate to protect the smallest charities, and also to make sure that we remove the eligibility threshold so that charities can still claim employer NICS reliefs when they're eligible, and that next year more than half of employers, including charities, will either gain or see no change in their NICS liabilities. We're doing everything that we can to protect this absolutely vital sector. And going forwards, what we hope is that as we grow the economy, as we improve people's living standards, as we improve people's lives and tackle some of the chronic problems this country has, like homelessness, that they are then freed up to be able to help everybody in this country to live the richer, larger lives that they deserve.
So on the increase to employer national insurance contributions, how do you think that will impact the services that charities are able to provide, particularly next year when the changes take effect? Well,
it's obviously, it's a tough decision, and I don't want to pretend that for some charities there won't be an impact. There will. The voluntary sector is used to spinning gold out of thread every single day. That's what I want to say. I'm not in it anymore, but that is what charities do. And I think in the discussions that Minister Peacock has had with the sector, although they are concerned about the impact, they recognise that we've taken these steps to try and protect charities, in particular the smaller charities, from that. They recognise that the tax relief system is one of the most generous in the world, and they also recognise that if we are able to meet the missions, that will substantially change the lives of the people that are their beneficiaries. So we're positive about our relationship with the charity sector, and I think they are very realistic that lots needs to be fixed in this country, and it's by working together we can do much more.
One final question: as someone who has worked in the sector, how would you navigate a charity organisation through the next few years?
Well, like I said, we want a better partnership with them. I think from my point of view in government now, the value of charities is not just the work that they do directly with people, it's the research that they produce, it's how they inform policy, it's how they challenge and hold government to account. And we are very keen that they understand that they don't just have a right to speak up, but they have a duty to speak up on behalf of their beneficiaries when they think that we're getting things wrong. We think we'll make better decisions as a government if they understand that that's the relationship that we want with them. We'd also appreciate it if they would speak up when we're getting things right, but it's absolutely right that we have an independent charity sector in this country that are able to hold our feet to the fire.
Yeah, thanks, Liz. Before we let you go, Bio, did you need to come in?
Yes, apologies, Chair. I wanted to also declare an interest. I actually am from the creative sector. Before I came into this house, I own a creative agency and run grassroots music festivals.
Oh, fab. Have to invite me sometime.
Yeah, why not?
Anyone else? No. Okay. Before I let you go, I also need to declare an interest for my family connections in cricket, but I did want to ask you about cricket. You've spoken a lot about facilities, the importance of facilities, how you're improving facilities for girls, etc., etc., etc. What do you think are the likely consequences of not committing to the previous government's £35 million investment towards grassroots cricket initiatives in state schools?
We're obviously going through business planning at the moment, so we haven't made any final decisions about the shape of departmental funding. But the Prime Minister obviously was asked about this by the outgoing leader of the opposition recently in the House, and reiterated our strong support for cricket. It's something that is very much on my agenda. It's come across my desk on a number of occasions. I know that cricket is a sport that brings a lot of joy to a lot of people, and also that we're very good at, and we want to make sure that it can continue to thrive and that young people can access it.
And cricket is something that really captures the imagination of some of those communities we're desperate to reach into as well. Thank you. Look, we've covered so much ground today, and we haven't even gotten to things like libraries or gambling or a lot of arts and culture, But I'm hoping that this will be the first of many times that we see you in front of us, as torturous as it may be. So we thank you for Secretary of State and PermSec for your time and your patience with us this afternoon, and we look forward to seeing you again in the future. Order.